There are evenings in Oxford when even the rain seems to move with discretion, hesitant, deferential, as if reluctant to disturb the older stones. That night, the night before the death in Chapel Row, I sat alone in my flat with the window ajar, letting the sound of it seep through. It was the kind of rain that polishes memory rather than erases it. I remember the faint chime from the clock tower across the road, the sigh of tires on wet tarmac, the tremor of distant laughter that reminded me I lived among the living only by accident. A crossword lay folded beside the whiskey glass. It was not a particularly challenging one. A provincial paper, the Oxford Mail, I think. Yet a single clue had managed to halt me in that peculiar way of words that wait to be found. A word for the lost, found again. 7. I stared at it for some time. Lost could mean anything. Missing, departed, forgotten. Found again could mean saved, returned, perhaps even forgiven. None of the answers seemed to fit both the definition and the feeling. I left it blank and took another sip, the bitter scent of peat softening into thought. It was Lewis who had mentioned Chapel Row earlier that afternoon, quite casually in the car. He'd been talking about the new cafe they'd opened near the Bodleian and said, in passing, that the old terrace behind St. Bede's had finally been repainted. Funny name, he said, for such a grim little lane. Chapel Row. I'd smiled without answering. Some places insist on keeping their sadness tidy. When the telephone rang, I almost didn't answer. It had the unmistakable tone of something official, something that would ask me to leave the quiet and return to the theater of the inexplicable. But habit is a kind of superstition, and I obeyed it. Strange's voice came through the static. Tired, unembellished, a body found near St. Bede's. No signs of violence, college connections possible. He said it might be nothing. He always said that. After he hung up, I sat for a while in the half-dark. The radio, still murmuring some fragment of Mozart, seemed to falter, as if aware of the change in the air. I've never quite understood why certain calls, certain deaths, disturb me before I know anything about them. It isn't a premonition. More likely, it's the memory of having seen too many quiet tragedies disguised as ordinary nights. Outside, the rain gathered itself into a steady rhythm, each drop making its small confession against the glass. I thought of St. Bede's, the smell of varnish in the chapel pews, the echo of Latin verses spoken to no one in particular, the faint smell of chalk that clings to old academic rooms long after the term has ended. Oxford at night always feels like a city rehearsing its own ghosts. I put on my coat, though I had no intention of leaving yet, the habit of readiness again. I looked once more at the crossword. The empty space beside that clue seemed suddenly significant, an aperture in the page. A word for the lost, found again. I wondered, idly, if redemption ever counted as discovery or merely reprieve. By the time I stepped to the window, the rain had thickened into mist. Across the street, the lights of the college lodgings shimmered as though seen through tears not yet admitted. Somewhere below, a cat darted under a parked car, seeking dry shelter. Everything in Oxford seeks shelter eventually. From guilt, from age, from its own intellect. I turned off the radio. The silence that followed had a pulse. There are moments when one becomes aware that life is about to tilt ever so slightly on its hinge. I felt that then. The quiet recognition that tomorrow would require explanation, and that explanation would, in all likelihood, disappoint everyone involved. Before I went to bed, I scribbled a few words on the newspaper margin. St. Bede's, Chapel Row, rain. It wasn't a note for the case. I didn't yet know there was one. It was simply a way of keeping the evening from dissolving entirely. Some nights deserve to be remembered before they are understood. I left the lamp burning, an old habit I pretend is for reading, but which is, in truth, for company. As I drifted toward sleep, I heard again the distant chime of the tower and thought, foolishly, that the sound resembled a line of verse I had once misremembered, et nihil ultra nisi pluvia. Nothing beyond but rain. In the morning, there would be a call from Lewis. There would be the report, the body on the steps, the notebook. But that night, Oxford was only rain, and I, for once, was merely its witness. Lewis drove that morning with the patience of a man resigned to my silences. The roads glistened like ink, the kind that leaves smudges on the edge of thought. I watched the spires appear one by one through the drizzle, faint and deliberate, as though Oxford were taking care not to reveal itself all at once. There are cities that wear their age proudly. Oxford wears its regret. The call had come early. A body found near St. Bede's. Male, middle-aged, possibly academic. No signs of struggle, the sergeant had said. Those are the cases that unsettle me most. Deaths that appear to have taken the world into their confidence before I'm invited. Chapel Row was a short street, narrow enough to make the police van look indecently large. Ivy climbed the walls in wet, blackened veins. A constable stood outside a gate, his expression apologetic, as though the dead man's existence were a small social inconvenience. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cold tobacco and candle wax, an old academic scent, half domestic, half devotional. Dr. Jonathan Ware, fellow in classics, 48, married, no children. The doctor's note on the mantelpiece mentioned heart failure, but even the word looked uncertain, written as if in parentheses. Ware's body lay where it had fallen. Just inside the doorway, one hand extended toward a brass umbrella stand. He was dressed, as though for a dinner he never reached. His face, oddly serene, might have belonged to a man awaiting applause after a difficult lecture. Lewis hovered nearby, notebook ready. I remember telling him not to bother. Some rooms announce their truths without words. The window was shut, the latch fastened. A damp umbrella leaned beside the door, neatly closed, the handle wiped dry. I touched it once, then set it back. People rarely tidy before dying. A small leather-bound notebook lay half beneath the chair. I opened it carefully, expecting the routine. Shopping lists, appointments, banalities of a life ending too soon. Instead, there were lines of Latin, verses, corrections, small marginalia in 2 different inks. Near the middle, one note in English. He wrote her name in the margin. No context, no date. The kind of fragment that suggests intimacy, not scholarship. Lewis pointed toward a tray on the bureau. 2 glasses, one half full, one empty. I asked who had found him. The housekeeper, apparently. A Mrs. Plowden. She'd come in just after 8 to make tea. Found the door ajar and the body on the floor. I could hear her in the kitchen even then, the low murmur of someone trying to weep correctly. I stepped outside for a moment. The cloister that ran between the chapel and the row was dark despite the morning. I've always thought stone absorbs sorrow better than flesh. It holds it longer, too. The chapel bell tolled once, by accident perhaps. A note too heavy for its own echo. In that sound, I thought of the crossword again. A word for the lost, found again. A bell finds no one, yet insists on being heard. When I returned inside, Lewis had been talking to the doctor. Nothing conclusive. A weak heart, stress, possible fall. Ware's watch had stopped at 10:17. The doctor's manner suggested relief more than curiosity. Natural deaths save everyone paperwork. Before we left, I glanced once more at the notebook. The Latin text was a translation of Catullus. Ille mi paresse Deo videtur. He seems to me equal to a god. But Ware's version altered a line, almost imperceptibly. Instead of sublime redentum, smiling sweetly, he had written sublime tacitum, silently exalted. A small shift, but it changed everything. Perhaps it was the scholar's whim, or perhaps a private message disguised as learning. Some men confess only through scholarship. Outside, Lewis said something about lunch, his tone a careful mixture of habit and hunger. I told him we'd go to the college first. He looked mildly disappointed. I envied his appetite. As we walked along the cobbled lane, the air hung heavy with the smell of wet stone and old sermons. I thought of the umbrella again, folded, immaculate, though the world had been drowning. Somewhere in that contradiction was the beginning of truth, though I could not yet name it. I paused by the cloister arch, watching rain slide along the carvings, blurring centuries into one long lament. Deaths in Oxford are never simple. They borrow the city's vocabulary of restraint. A quiet body, a polite mystery, a Latin word for grief too clever to translate. That night, when I returned home, I wrote the clue from memory into the margin of my paper. A word for the lost. Found again. 7. I still had no answer. But I suspected that the man in Chapel Row had been searching for one too. There are women whose composure unsettles more than tears. Mrs. Ware was one of them. I remember her standing by the tall window of the drawing room, the mauve fabric of her dress merging with the heavy curtains behind her, as though she might slip into the drapery and vanish if one looked away. The color suited her, neither mourning nor defiance, something precisely between. Lewis had made the introductions, his voice low, as if afraid to bruise the air. She turned from the light, smiled faintly, and extended a hand that felt cool but not weak. Her first words were practical. The police had been kind, she said. The college, less so. There was a pause before the next line. She supposed one ought not to expect warmth from a place that had never believed in her existence. Her husband, she told us, had been a scholar first, and everything else later. It was a statement of habit, not bitterness, though the difference between the two is often difficult to judge. She spoke with the patience of someone long accustomed to waiting through silence. There had been talk of his heart, she said, but he would not rest. Too much translating to do, too many notes. He had been working late the night before, and she had gone to bed early. The doctor thought perhaps, her voice faltered here, perhaps the strain of his work had been the final thing. I nodded in the manner required by civility, but it was her use of the word strain that struck me. Not effort, not pressure, but something more intimate, as though she referred to a thread drawn too tight between them. Lewis asked the usual questions. Who had seen him last, whether he had been troubled, whether there was anyone to whom he might have confided a fear. She answered carefully, her gaze occasionally drifting toward the bookshelf as if to borrow composure from the spines. There had been a colleague, Dr. Lomas, who visited often, and another, Dr. Vale, though not so much in recent months. She mentioned them without accusation, almost absently, but I felt the faintest tremor of irony in her tone when she said the woman's name. A clock ticked somewhere behind us, too loud for the size of the room. I let the silence lengthen before I asked whether her husband had kept a journal or any private notes. She gestured to a small escritoire near the hearth. I'd already seen it on the way in, the key still in the lock. Inside, the top drawer held paper, a fountain pen, several envelopes addressed but unsealed, and a single pressed violet folded into tissue. The kind of small, deliberate relic people keep only when it has ceased to belong to the world. Lewis busied himself with his notebook. I remained by the desk, pretending to read the titles along the shelf. Most were classical texts, but a few modern volumes intruded. Eliot, Houseman, Hardy. I took one down at random, a copy of A Shropshire Lad, its margins annotated in two hands, one faint and looping, the other neat and severe. On page 37 a verse underlined twice, and I am 22, and oh, 'tis true, 'tis true. A young man's lament copied by an older hand. I closed the book quietly. She noticed, He liked that one, she said, though I always thought it too sentimental. I asked whether her husband had ever written poetry himself. Her eyes lifted, not to meet mine, but to some memory beyond me. Only once, she said. A translation, really, from Catullus. I remembered then the altered line in his notebook, the shift from smiling sweetly to silently exalted. There are changes scholars make for elegance and others for concealment. Before we left, she offered tea. I declined, though Lewis accepted. She poured it slowly, each motion performed with an almost ceremonial care. When he thanked her, she smiled again, but this time her gaze lingered a fraction too long on the steam rising from the cup, as if measuring its vanishing. At the door, I asked a final question, whether she had been in the chapel recently. Her answer came too quickly. No, not for months. I mentioned, casually, that her husband had been seen there 2 evenings before his death. She said nothing, only adjusted the cuff of her sleeve. The gesture itself was answer enough. Outside, the afternoon had turned to mist. Lewis muttered that she didn't seem particularly grief-stricken. I said that some people grieve in translation. It never quite reaches the language of expression. As we walked away, I glanced once more at the upper window. A shadow moved behind the glass. Perhaps her reflection. Either way, it was watching. Later that night, when I returned home, I opened the notebook again. The phrase stood out more sharply now. He wrote her name in the margin. It wasn't just an observation, it was instruction. Someone had been written into the wrong place, and someone else had erased themselves neatly from the page. I closed the book and reached for the crossword. A new clue waited. Absence, lightly spoken. 4. I smiled, despite myself. The answer was hush. There are certain rooms in Oxford where conversation never quite dies. It simply lingers, waiting in the air for someone else to give it form again. The senior common room at St. Bede's was one of them. Even in mourning, it had a civility that bordered on indecency. The aroma of weak Darjeeling mingled with furniture polish, and the dons, arrayed like faded portraits, performed the delicate choreography of condolence without conviction. Lewis and I arrived midway through what was politely termed a small gathering in remembrance. I've always found such occasions unbearable. Too little grief to be honest, too much ritual to be humane. Ware's colleagues had gathered under the pretext of tea, though their glances suggested they'd come to measure the silence left behind and decide how best to rearrange it. Dr. Henry Lomas greeted us first, a narrow man with a scholar's stoop and the faint tremor of habitual restraint. He had been Ware's closest collaborator, or so I'd been told, and wasted no time in assuring me that his friend's death had been entirely unforeseen. His tone, however, lacked surprise. There was a tremor in his thumb as he stirred his tea, a gesture too small for guilt, but too large for indifference. Dr. Serena Vale joined us soon after, her arrival quiet, yet curiously theatrical. She had the kind of composure that announces itself, a calm born not of peace but of self-editing. Her voice was low, shaped by years of speaking to rooms that never truly listened. She spoke warmly of Ware's intellect, less warmly of his temperament. A perfectionist, she said, though not without affection. He could make enemies without raising his voice. She smiled when she said it, but there was an old bruise behind the words. Lewis, obliging as ever, inquired about Ware's recent work. Vale answered that he had been preparing a revised translation of Catullus, but that the project had stalled. Lomas interjected, gently but with emphasis, that it had not stalled, merely deepened. Their eyes met briefly across the teacups, a collision of footnotes and resentment. I had the distinct impression that Ware's scholarship had been a battleground disguised as collaboration. It was then I noticed the wine bottle on the sideboard. The label was old, the cork half pulled, and beside it stood 2 unused glasses. The bottle read, Chapel Row Reserve, 1962. The name caught at something in my mind. Not the wine itself, but the date. I remembered a note in Ware's notebook, a reference to Anno Aldhuern, the year of Catullus's death. Coincidence, perhaps, but coincidences, I found, are Oxford's favorite disguise. Vale, catching my glance, explained that Ware had brought the bottle a week before his death, intending it for the college dinner that never happened. I asked who else had been invited. She hesitated before answering that only Lomas and she had known. I asked nothing further, though the silence that followed was heavy enough to account for a missing guest. As the tea cooled, conversation drifted towards safer subjects. The weather, term schedules, the new bursar's reforms. Yet even in that dullness, certain words acquired weight. When Lomas mentioned the word translation, Vale's hand tightened around her cup. When Vale spoke of legacy, Lomas's eyes darted to the portrait of the college founder above the mantel. These were scholars accustomed to hiding meaning beneath tone, like a pun waiting to be misread. Lewis excused himself to examine the college chapel, muttering something about layout. I stayed. I've learned that truth often requires company only long enough for self-betrayal to begin. It was Lomas who faltered first. He leaned forward, his voice lower, confiding almost. Ware had grown erratic, he said, obsessive about minor errors in old texts. He had even suggested that one of their joint papers contained a mistranslation so grave it could alter reputations. Lomas's eyes flickered toward Vale, who was tracing the rim of her saucer with a fingertip, her expression unreadable. I asked whether Ware had ever shown them proof. Lomas hesitated. No, only hints. Catullus, again. Love and betrayal, he said. Always that. When we left, the corridor outside smelled faintly of damp wool and old chalk. Lewis was waiting by the door, looking faintly embarrassed, as though he'd overheard something private by accident. He said the chapel bell rope was frayed, nearly severed. I told him to make a note of it. He asked if it mattered. I said everything mattered until it didn't. As we stepped into the quadrangle, the rain had begun again, soft as memory. I looked back once through the mullioned window. Vale and Lomas stood by the fire, unmoving, their faces half reflected in the glass. Two scholars rehearsing their alibis in silence. That night, when I sat again with my crossword, I returned to the old clue. A word for the lost, found again. The letters now seemed to arrange themselves differently. If redemption was too easy, perhaps the answer lay closer to home. Something fragile, almost forgotten. Recall. Or perhaps, I thought, regret. The Bodleian has its own temperature of silence, not absence of sound, but an arrangement of stillness. The faint rustle of a page, the cautious cough of a scholar, the muffled tread of someone who believes knowledge is a kind of penance. That afternoon, it was raining again, and the wet air had crept in through the high windows, carrying with it the smell of soaked stone and decaying leather. I've always liked that smell. It reminds me that everything written is, eventually, perishable. Lewis waited downstairs, nursing an indifference to Latin. I had come to trace the notes in Ware's leather notebook, the half-translated verses, the marginal remarks. The librarian, a severe woman whose spectacles seemed forged from the same glass as the reading lamps, fetched the files with a reverence that would have suited a relic. She mentioned that Ware had visited 3 times in the week before his death, always requesting the same item, the Bede manuscript, 1880. I thanked her and waited until she left before opening it. Inside were pages written in a feminine hand, elegant but uneven, the ink varying as though the writer had stopped often to think. It was a diary of sorts, the private reflections of one Eleanor March, daughter of the college founder. Most entries were devotional in tone, the kind that praise humility by the paragraph. But midway through, the language shifted. Latin poems, fragments of translation, phrases more sensual than pious. Venit amor et manet. Love comes and remains. Yet in Ware's notebook, the same line had been rendered differently. Venit amor et fugit. Love comes and flees. I copied both into my own notes. The distinction struck me more than it should have. Scholars alter words for accuracy. Lovers alter them for memory. A thin photograph slipped from the binding. 3 figures on the chapel steps, one of them Ware, a much younger Lomas beside him, and a woman whose face was turned away from the light. I wondered if she was Eleanor's descendant or only her echo. Oxford breeds repetitions like that. Same windows, same scandals, only the handwriting changes. As I studied the image, I noticed something peculiar. Ware's hand rested on the stone railing, but his shadow fell in the opposite direction from the others. Perhaps the photograph had been retouched, or perhaps the truth, like light, had simply bent around him. I replaced it quietly and turned back to the diary. There was an unfinished line at the bottom of one page. He taught me how to read by candlelight. He said every flame is a word. The next page had been torn out. The edges were too clean for accident. I felt the familiar tug, the small, precise irritation of knowing that something essential had been removed and that its absence now told a different story than its presence ever could. Lewis appeared then, awkwardly holding 2 cups of tea. He whispered, as though in church, that the porter at St. Bede's remembered Ware, asking about a lost inscription in the chapel. I asked if the porter recalled his tone. Lewis frowned, said he'd seemed thoughtful, not troubled. I said those 2 often share a border. As he spoke, my eyes caught a faint penciled note in the margin of the diary. See folio 42. Confession by H.L. The librarian confirmed that folio 42 was missing, last borrowed by Ware himself. I asked when it had vanished. She replied that the record ended 3 days before his death. I remember the way her hand rested protectively on the ledger, as though guarding the absences within it. When we stepped outside, the rain had ceased, though the stones still glistened with its memory. Lewis said something about dinner, but I wasn't listening. I was thinking about the misquotation. How a single altered verb could shift a century of meaning. Manet to fugit, staying to fleeing, fidelity to regret. Ware hadn't mistranslated the line, he'd rewritten it. Back at my flat, I spread the 2 copies side by side. Ware's notebook and my own. The contrast was delicate, almost invisible unless one looked long enough. I stared until the letters blurred, until I could almost imagine hearing Ware's pen scratch the paper, hesitating on the edge of a truth too personal to publish. It was near midnight when I found the answer to a clue that had sat unsolved for days. A word for the lost, found again. 7. The solution appeared suddenly, as they sometimes do, rising like something retrieved from the dark. Redeemed. I wrote it in ink, but the letters looked strange, as though belonging to someone else's hand. I closed the book and poured a drink. The rain began again, soft and uneven, tapping against the window like a scholar turning pages in the next room. And in that quiet rhythm, I felt the faint, unspoken presence of the missing page. Not gone, merely waiting to be read by a different kind of light. There are moments when Oxford seems to speak more clearly through water than through words. That afternoon the city had become a mirror of itself. Pavements glistening, spires dissolving into pools, the whole landscape whispering of some patient undoing. Lewis drove with one hand on the wheel and the other fidgeting at the radio, though he never turned it on. He knew I disliked company that required volume. We arrived at St. Bede's just as the rain began again, a thin, determined drizzle that flattened the color of everything it touched. The porter met us at the lodge, holding an envelope in his palm like a fragile relic. It had been left, he said, by an unknown visitor. No name, no address. Only a few words written in a delicate, uneven hand. For Inspector M. I took it from him, noticing at once the faint smudge where a thumb had pressed too long. The envelope was damp but intact, sealed with an old-fashioned drop of wax that had almost melted away in the weather. I turned it over, weighing its silence. Letters arrive too late in my life. A habit of the living to tell the dead what they might have done differently. Lewis hovered beside me as I broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet, the ink blurred at the edges, but legible enough. The truth lies beneath the inscription. No signature, no date, only those 6 words. We stood under the arch for a while, listening to the water run from the gutters. I asked the porter who had delivered it. He hesitated, then mentioned a figure in a raincoat. Tall, possibly a woman, though he couldn't be sure. She had left it at the counter and walked toward the chapel. The detail was enough. The chapel at St. Bede's is a small affair, Romanesque, almost austere, its beauty concealed by restraint. The air inside held that particular chill of places where belief has long since departed, but formality remains. The candles had been extinguished, leaving only the smell of wax and the faint echo of earlier prayers. I moved down the aisle, my shoes clicking against stone, and stopped before the main plaque on the northern wall. A dedication to Sir Francis March, benefactor and founder. The inscription, in Latin, praised humility and scholarship in equal measure, which always struck me as a curious pairing. Beneath it, faint chisel marks, fresh ones. The surface seemed recently disturbed, as though someone had been at it with clumsy reverence. Brushed a hand across the lower edge, feeling where the letters dipped more deeply than the rest. Lewis, beside me, asked what I saw. "Nothing yet," I said. Then I noticed the small indentation of a candle stand, moved recently from its usual place, its base leaving a faint circle of dust and damp. The stand had been dragged aside deliberately. The marks beneath led to a flagstone slightly misaligned with the rest. Lewis bent to inspect it, but I told him to leave it. Too soon. Some truths need to linger before they reveal themselves. I wanted first to understand the motive behind the message, beneath the inscription, beneath, not within. Whoever had written that letter understood the difference between concealment and confession. The verger entered then. A nervous man, stooped and courteous. He spoke softly, as if afraid to interrupt the walls. He remembered Ware coming here 2 nights before his death. Had asked about the old founder's plaque, whether the Latin translation had ever been revised. The verger told him it had not. But Ware had seemed unconvinced, kept tracing his finger over the last word. Caritas. Charity. Then he'd asked about a photograph once displayed in the vestry. The verger had said it went missing years ago, one showing the founder's daughter, Eleanor, standing in the very spot where we now stood. The verger's account left a faint aftertaste of unease. I thanked him and let him go. When his footsteps had faded, I looked again at the word "where" had touched. The final letter of Caritas had been recut, its serif sharper than the rest. Whoever did it knew Latin well enough to hide meaning in plain sight. I jotted a translation in my notebook, reversing the letters as Ware might have done for a puzzle. Satirac. It meant nothing. But rearranged. Sacrati. Consecrated. I felt the small click of something almost forming, like a lock turning halfway. Outside, the rain had grown heavier. Lewis muttered about dinner and the impossibility of getting a cab in this weather. I told him to go ahead. I needed a few minutes more. The chapel light had dimmed to a watery gold, the kind that blurs edges and reveals shapes in reflection. I looked once more at the misaligned flagstone. Its surface caught the candlelight like skin holding breath. Beneath it, I thought, was either a truth or another distraction, both equally worth digging for. When I stepped outside, the porter had gone. The envelope lay where I had dropped it, now soaked through, its ink bleeding into the stone. The truth lies beneath the inscription. I picked it up, folded it once more, and slipped it into my coat. As I walked away, I passed the college notice board. A single sheet fluttered there, pinned crookedly against the rain. Chapel maintenance postponed until further notice. I smiled without humor. Oxford has always known how to postpone its confessions. There are certain faces that refuse to age in memory. They stay suspended in the amber of a single instant, preserved, unaltered, and quietly reproachful. Hers was one of them. I'd stared at the photograph so often by then that I almost forgot it was a picture and not a memory of my own. 3 figures on the chapel steps, where, standing in the center, Lomas slightly behind him, and the girl, the unnamed girl, caught mid-turn as though she had just heard her name spoken by someone who shouldn't have known it. Her initials, according to the college register, were LM. A research assistant, 5 years gone from Oxford. Her name, when I found it at last, was Laura Merton. There was a faint absurdity in the discovery, as though I had unearthed a footnote to a poem that no longer existed. Lewis, ever practical, made the arrangements for the journey to Cornwall, where she now lived. He said I should leave it to the local police. I told him, not unkindly, that local police are excellent at lost dogs and fallen fences, but less attuned to Latin misquotations and the subtler tragedies of intellect. The train to Cornwall took half a day. Rain followed us for most of it, turning the countryside into a moving reflection. I remember thinking that England, seen through wet glass, looks like it's been trying to forget itself for centuries. Her house stood on a cliff overlooking the sea, small, whitewashed, and too tidy for comfort. She opened the door before I could knock, as though she had been expecting someone, though not necessarily me. She recognized my name. Everyone in Oxford does, for better or worse, and invited me in with a composure that felt learned rather than natural. She said she had heard about Dr. Ware. Her tone suggested she had also imagined it might happen. There was something in her gaze, a mixture of fatigue and defiance, that reminded me of those who have survived not tragedy but its repetition. She made tea. The ritual was slow, deliberate, almost penitential. I told her about the notebook, the diary fragments, the Latin verse. She nodded as though reciting them silently alongside me. When I mentioned the phrase he wrote her name in the margin, she looked away, toward the sea framed by the window. She said softly that Ware had once told her that all translation is an act of betrayal, that language can't move from one heart to another without losing its pulse. I asked whether the notebook was hers. She said no, but she had seen it once. It had belonged to someone else before either of them, someone who had loved in the wrong century. We spoke, or rather circled, for nearly an hour. Each question I asked seemed to summon an echo rather than an answer. She mentioned that Ware had been working to expose a forgery within the college, an inscription altered in the chapel to conceal a scandal that would have shamed the founder's family. I asked if she had helped him. She smiled then, faintly, as if at her own naivety. She said she had tried. But Oxford does not reward truth-telling. It only tolerates confession when the confessor is already ruined. There was one moment when her voice faltered. It came when I asked why she had left so abruptly 5 years ago. She said it had been for her health, then stopped. I waited, and after a pause she corrected herself. For my conscience, she said. I did not press her. Some lies arrive already bruised enough to resemble truth. Before leaving, I asked to see the original photograph if she still had it. She hesitated, then retrieved it from a drawer. The print was older than the copy at St. Bede's, darker around the edges. As I studied it again, something caught my eye. A faint reflection in the chapel window behind them. A second figure, half visible, standing just outside the frame. I looked closer. The posture was unmistakable. Serena Vale. When I mentioned it, Laura closed the drawer abruptly. She said some memories must remain blurred. They are safer that way. I told her that blurred things have a habit of sharpening themselves when least expected. She smiled then, but there was no warmth in it. The rain had stopped when I stepped outside. The sea stretched below, pale and merciless, its horizon indistinguishable from the sky. I stood for a while watching the waves erase each other, one by one, and thought of Ware tracing the Latin line with his finger. Venit amor et fugit. Love comes and flees. On the train back, I took out my crossword. A new clue awaited. 2 lives, 1 reflection, 6. It took me until Reading to solve it. Mirror. When I reached Oxford that night, I went straight to the chapel. The stone floor was still damp from the day's rain, and the plaque beneath the inscription gleamed faintly in the candlelight. I touched the letters as Ware must have done. For the first time, I thought I understood what he had seen. That every truth, like a photograph, depends on where one stands when the light enters. There are cases that seem to breathe again just when you think they've gone cold. They rise from the quiet like something underwater, breaking the surface only long enough to remind you that nothing stays buried in Oxford for long. The Ware affair was like that. Restless, unfinished, almost insolent in the way it refused to settle into clarity. By then, the official cause had been written neatly into a file. Natural causes, accelerated by stress. Yet everything about it felt slightly off-center, as if the truth itself had been misfiled under a similar but incorrect heading. I had seen that kind of error before. It was never accidental. Lewis and I returned to St. Bede's on a Thursday that smelt faintly of wet chalk and wood smoke. The porter nodded at us with the weary complicity of someone who had seen too many questions unearth too few answers. In the common room, Dr. Lomas poured tea as though practicing for an audience, his movements delicate, precise, rehearsed. He said the college was still shaken by Ware's passing, though his tone suggested relief, dressed as grief. He referred again to Ware's difficult temperament and to the linguistic quarrel that had soured their last months together. It was a curious phrase. Quarrel, not disagreement. Quarrels require emotion, and scholars prefer detachment. He spoke of Ware's obsession with a translation he had supposedly completed years earlier. The same project that had once tied his reputation to Serena Vale's. I watched Lomas's hands as he talked. Each time he mentioned her name, his fingers trembled slightly before finding steadiness again. I asked when he had last seen her. He said a few days before the funeral, and that she had seemed distressed but dignified. A well-trained sentence, too smooth to be believed. Lewis, meanwhile, had been speaking to one of the students who worked part-time in the library. The young man had found a torn page tucked behind a dictionary of medieval Latin. He brought it to me later, folded twice. The paper was from Ware's notebook, the same narrow-lined kind, same ink tone. But the handwriting was different, feminine. The line read, "He believed love could be redeemed through grammar." Below it, in Ware's own hand, a reply. False resurrections always begin with good intentions. I spent that evening at the Randolph, nursing a whiskey that refused to taste like comfort. The words followed me around the rim of the glass. False resurrections. Oxford specialized in them. Reputations, affairs, friendships, each exhumed when convenient, reburied when not. I wondered which of them Ware had been trying to resurrect, and whether someone had decided he'd gone too far. The next morning, Serena Vale agreed to see me. Her rooms were high in the north wing of the college, overlooking the quadrangle where the first crocuses had begun to appear, small, defiant bruises of color against the frost. She seemed tired, older than before, though not physically. It was the kind of age that comes from knowing too much and being allowed to say none of it. She spoke of Ware's brilliance with a precision that sounded like morning rehearsed for an examiner. He had been a man of principle, she said, but also of vanity. The two had fought often over his insistence that translation should preserve the imperfections of emotion rather than polish them into correctness. I asked if she had ever loved him. She smiled at that, a slow, brittle curve of amusement. She said love is an untidy translator. It alters the text beyond recognition. Then she asked if I believed in redemption. I told her it depended who was asking. As she rose to refill the teapot, a small notebook slid from her desk and fell open on the carpet. I stooped to hand it back and saw the inside cover before she closed it. A sketch of a Latin inscription, the same chapel dedication Ware had examined before his death. I asked about it. She said it was merely a study for a lecture, though her hand shook slightly as she replaced it on the desk. When I mentioned that the carving had been altered, she went still. The silence that followed felt heavier than any confession. Outside, the bells began to ring for evensong, distant, fractured notes that never quite agreed with each other. I left her there, framed against the window, a silhouette blurred by light. That night, alone again, I returned to the crossword. One of the clues read, "Restored but not reborn, 13. I stared at it longer than I should have. Eventually I filled in the answer. Resurrectional. Too literal, perhaps, but close enough. I closed the paper and sat back. In my mind, I could still see Ware tracing his finger over the chapel wall, that altered word. Caritas, charity, or perhaps pity, its final letter deepened by a hand that wanted to change meaning without leaving a mark. And I thought again of the line, "False resurrections always begin with good intentions." Oxford had taught me that well. There are nights in Oxford when sound itself seems reluctant to linger. That evening, the air was too still for rain, too heavy for wind, the kind of silence that feels older than the city it inhabits. I walked alone to St. Bede's without purpose, perhaps, though purpose has a way of revealing itself only when one has ceased to look for it. The porter had gone. The gate stood open. Somewhere in the quadrangle a bell chimed a single note, flat and accidental. The chapel was unlit except for one small candle burning near the altar, its flame leaning to one side like a tired confession. I've never liked electric light in sacred places. It removes the possibility of shadow, and without shadow there can be no mystery. The door closed behind me with the faintest sigh, and in that half-dark I felt the same quiet anticipation one does before a piece of music begins. I moved toward the plaque where Ware's hand had last rested. The Latin inscription, Caritas omnia vincit, seemed almost innocent in the flickering light. Charity conquers all, except perhaps the kind extended too late. The fresh chisel marks were more visible now, their sharpness catching the candle's shimmer. Someone had recut the final word, deepened it, not to correct, but to conceal. The chapel smelled faintly of stone dust and rain. I crouched, tracing the lower corner of the plaque where the mortar had begun to crumble. Beneath it, just visible, a faint set of initials, SV. The letters had been deliberately scored shallow, as though they were meant to disappear under the next layer of devotion. Serena Vale. It was almost too obvious, and yet I'd learned that the obvious is only dangerous when true. I heard her before I saw her. The soft tap of shoes on the aisle, the measured intake of breath meant to announce presence without apology. She stood near the door, half in shadow, half in that wavering amber light. Her coat was unbuttoned, rainwater glinting on the sleeve. I asked if she'd come to pray. She said she no longer knew what that word meant. She came forward, slowly, her gaze fixed not on me but on the plaque. She said she had loved the man who'd written those words and hated the man who'd lived them. It took me a moment to understand she was speaking of Ware. I asked whether she had altered the inscription. Her silence was answer enough, though not confession. She said the college would never have allowed the truth carved in stone, that Ware had uncovered something the world preferred to leave in Latin, half-translated, unexamined. When I asked what that truth was, she said only that it wasn't his to uncover. The candle flickered then, as though disturbed by breath. I could smell wax melting, the faint sweetness of decay. She looked suddenly fragile, like someone performing composure at the edge of exhaustion. He came to me that night, she said, not to accuse, but to forgive. He had discovered what I'd done to his translation. The small deceit, the alteration of a single phrase to protect another's name. He told me it didn't matter, that meaning survives its mistakes. I wanted to believe him. I thought of the Latin line Ware had changed, venit amor, et mane turned to venit amor, et fugit. Love comes and flees. Perhaps he had been speaking to her even then. She sat down on one of the pews, her voice lowering until it barely belonged to sound. He was ill, she said. His heart, the doctors had warned him. He reached for me when he fell, and I thought if I could only hold him upright, the world would forgive the lie we'd built together. But he slipped. She covered her face then, not to cry, but to rest from the act of remembering. I stood there for what must have been minutes, but felt longer. The candle sputtered once, recovered, then burned steady. I told her I believed her, though belief in such moments is less a verdict than a courtesy. She said she had written the letter. The truth lies beneath the inscription. Hoping I would find him worth absolving. But I had come too late, as always. When I left, she remained seated, her hands folded like unspoken lines of a prayer she no longer knew. Outside, the rain had returned, fine and persistent. I turned once more toward the chapel window. The candle was still burning, a small point of light suspended in the dark. Neither confession nor absolution, merely endurance. That night, back in my flat, I poured a measure of whiskey and opened the crossword left on my desk. One clue waited unfinished. Faith that survives the dark. 5. I filled in the answer without hesitation. Candle. Then I closed the paper and let the light go out. There is a peculiar stillness that descends after truth has spoken. Not the clarity one imagines, but a faint exhaustion, as though the air itself has been holding its breath too long. In the days that followed the chapel, Oxford seemed to recoil into its usual disguise. The rain returned, the bells resumed their practiced indifference, and life, with its curious persistence, went on pretending that nothing of consequence had happened. Lewis said the coroner's report confirmed what I already knew. Heart failure, accelerated by shock. No evidence of foul play, the neat language of bureaucracy, built to contain what the soul refuses to. He asked whether I believed Serena Vale's account. I told him belief is an untidy thing. Like mercy, it can't always be justified. He didn't press the matter. Perhaps he saw that I was speaking more to myself than to him. I visited the college once more, out of habit rather than duty. Chapel Row looked cleaner now, scrubbed of its tragedy by rain and time. The porter nodded at me with cautious relief, the kind people reserve for ghosts who choose not to linger. Inside, the chapel smelled faintly of damp and candle smoke. The single flame that had survived that night was gone, leaving only a dark wick and a pool of cooled wax like congealed thought. I sat in the back pew and tried to remember Ware as he must have been before ambition found him, before love and translation conspired to blur the meaning of both. He had been, by all accounts, a man obsessed with precision, and yet he had died surrounded by errors, a miscut inscription, a falsified phrase, a woman who mistook absolution for love. Perhaps that was what drew me to him, the conviction that language could redeem what life could not. The plaque on the wall gleamed dully in the morning light. Caritas omnia vincit. Charity conquers all. The irony, I suppose, was that it had conquered nothing, but the word caritas lingered with me. Not the sentiment, but its etymology. Love stripped of passion, rendered into kindness. I had looked it up later that night, between drinks and silence. The root lay in dear, from the old word cara, meaning sorrow. Love at its origin was something paid for in grief. Lewis joined me briefly, shifting awkwardly on the wooden pew. He said the college planned to restore the plaque, to erase the amateur repairs. I asked whether they would restore the truth with it. He gave a small, uncertain smile. In Oxford, truth is merely another academic discipline. It can be taught, not practiced. As we left, I noticed Eleanor Ware standing at the far end of the cloister, her figure blurred by the glass. She was holding something in her hands. The leather notebook, closed now, bound with a black ribbon. She saw me and nodded, an acknowledgement rather than a greeting. When I approached, she said she had decided to keep it, not out of sentiment, but necessity. Some things, she said quietly, must remain written even when unread. She asked if I believed her husband had found peace. I told her peace was only another word for silence, and silence, I feared, had claimed him long before death did. Later, in my flat, I poured a measure of whiskey and unfolded the crossword I'd abandoned days earlier. The old clue still stared at me. A word for the lost, found again. 7. I smiled at its persistence. I had written redeemed once, but it had never quite fit. Now, looking at it anew, I realized the answer was not redemption at all. It was remember. The lost are never truly found. They are only remembered differently each time. I wrote the word neatly into the empty squares, then sat back and listened to the rain beginning again outside. The same sound that had started it all, the same rhythm Oxford keeps when it wishes to hide its conscience. The notebook was gone, the case closed, the truth officially satisfied. And yet something remained unsettled, as though meaning itself had shifted a degree to the left. Before turning in, I opened the window. Across the dark courtyard, the chapel windows glowed faintly from a service I hadn't known was being held. Voices rose, muffled by distance, fragments of Latin chant dissolving into the wet air. For a moment I thought I caught the word caritas again, that weary promise of love and loss intertwined. I closed the window and poured the last of the whiskey. There are words that survive translation not by accuracy, but by endurance. Words like faith, grief, memory, words like lost. And somewhere, beneath the rain and the stone, Oxford whispered them back, as it always does. Not to console, but to remind.